Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter, New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Schneier, joined as always my co-host Nick Filato. And today we're here to do a little more season preview for the New York Giants coming up in 2023. And you've heard it all off season, but you've heard, well, don't be excited about the Giants. They, won 9 games last year, but it's because they face an easy schedule, because they face some bad quarterbacks. But I feel like all of that doesn't account, or it doesn't take into account, I should say, some of the things that went wrong for the Giants last year. For example, their number one playmaker, expected playmaker going into the season, Kadarius Toney, was a net zero. Their number two, I would say, Kenny Golladay, was a net zero, by default. They had injuries at crazy times. I looked at the lineup that they went into that Dallas Thanksgiving game with, Nick. It was despicably bad. I mean, Tyree Phillips was their starting right tackle. Jack Anderson was starting at left guard. Gates, coming off that injury, was starting at center. They had slew of injuries. O'Dory was out. One of the edges was out. I forgot who. I think it was Aziz. Just Aziz. A slew of injuries in that game. So they dealt with some bad injuries last year. And one specific group of their team that we're going to talk about today, where they really hit injuries last year. And if you looked at the injury report already, Nick, for week one, took a breath of fresh air after. I can't remember a Giants season where week one it looked like that. Now, no offense to Javarius Owens of the world, God bless. I hope he gets healthy soon, but not a single starter on that list. And in my opinion, not a single important role player was on that injury report. I can't remember going into a week one like that forever. So there's a lot of reasons I think to be excited about the Giants in 2023. I think there's a lot of reason to be for your expectations to be optimistic and hopeful that they can take that next step, and that, even with a more difficult schedule, quote unquote, something that can be in a lot of ways fool's gold, right? A difficult schedule now that looks like a difficult schedule now may not be a difficult schedule in week 6, in week 4, in week 8. So Nick and I are going to dive into our 5 biggest reasons for having so much optimism about the Giants heading into this 2023 season, Nick. And let's start us off. We're going to do it this way, going from 1 to 5. So the reason we're most excited for first, and then the one, and then in order 2, 3, 4, 5. So Nick, start us off with the reason we're most excited about the Giants heading into 2023.
So, Dan, I'm not 100% certain if this is the reason we're most excited, but it's one talking point that I don't feel like we're discussing enough that can realistically manifest. And that's why we have it 1. And that is the new and improved defensive front and what that's going to mean in terms of applying pressure on opposing quarterbacks. Because not only do you have Kayvon Thibodeau entering his second year, let's not forget he started his rookie season injured and did not appear until week 3 against the Dallas Cowboys. Not only do we have Dexter Lawrence entering his second season being a true bona fide stud, not only do we have Leonard Williams healthy, but we have Azeez Ojulari healthy, and we have depth. A'Shawn Robinson and Raheem Nunez-Roches are miles better than the depth that the New York Giants had last year. No offense to Ryder Anderson, Henry Mondu, and Justin Ellis, who more than likely should not be an NFL starter right now, or an NFL player, I should say. So the new and improved defensive line, that's going to solidify the run defense. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what is that going to do, Dan, in terms of rushing the passer with Wink Martindale as your defensive coordinator, who is going to create one-on-one matchups? Every center and guard wants to block Dexter Lawrence with help. They want adjacent help. But how are you going to give him adjacent help when you could bring a linebacker through the A-gap, or you're going to force the tackles to kick out into space to cover Isaiah Simmons, who's looking to scream off the edge? Or are you going to trust the running back to do that? If so, Isaiah Simmons can get home. I just think this defensive improvement up front, in the front 7 especially, but with those edges and the defensive linemen, it's going to result in the more sacks. And that's not something that I feel like Giant fans and Giant Nation are really talking about too much. We're talking more so about the additions of Darren Waller, Jalen Hyatt, and all of the explosive weapons that are so exciting. I'm really excited about that. You are as well. But dude, this defensive front, they could be top 5 in sacks. And I don't think that's a ridiculous statement, especially if only like 2 of the players that we were talking about take a developmental step. If Kayvon and Azeez take that developmental step, and then Dexter Lawrence and Leonard Williams just stagnate from what we saw last year, this team is going to be something special on defense.
I think you nailed it, Nick. Again, look, there's a lot of reasons to be excited about the Giants, I think, in 2023. But as far as the ceiling goes, I'm not positive there's a bigger area of this roster where there's a higher ceiling, I should say, than on the defensive front. And, there's some stats that back this up. So last season, the Giants only had 51 snaps where Dexter Lawrence, Leonard Williams, Kayvon Thibodeau, and Azeez Ojulari were on the field at the same time, which is absolutely insane from a luck standpoint. That's 51 plays over the course of a season. You get more in a game on the defense side of the ball. But during those 51 plays, 31 were pass attempts. They had a sack, 6 quarterback hits. That's 1 out of every 5 was a quarterback hit. A +5 win probability over expected. And these are all stats according to Doug Analytics. Shout out Doug Analytics. But also something I thought was cool, Nick. He brought up the EPA on those plays. The Giants defense had an EPA of 0.1 or minus 0.165. And just, for those who don't want to get bogged down in what that means, EPA is essentially expected points added. So it's like an advanced metric to kind of determine the TLDR on this is determine how impactful and effective you are as a defense or an offense on a per snap basis. And that number, Nick, would have topped the 49ers defense, who led the NFL with a minus 0.112 EPA. It was better than the 49ers, who led the NFL with that in those 51 snaps for those 4 on the field. You get those 4 on the field, Nick, plus A'Shawn Robinson wasn't even part of the mix. Plus, you have some actual depth with guys like Nacho to spell some of these guys and keep them fresh on the interior. Or, guys like Boogie Basham potentially and Isaiah Simmons to spell the 2 big ones, Azeez and Kayvon, and give them an opportunity to stay healthier as well on the edge. Now you're talking about better up front, better depth, and a defense that showed, at least in a small sample size, a flash of being dominant, better than any defense in the NFL from an EPA standpoint on a per snap basis. I think they have a chance to be top 5 or better than top 5. I look across the NFL, man, there are some impressive teams, the Eagles, the 49ers. There are a lot of impressive fronts, but I don't know for sure that the Giants are definitely much worse than those fronts when you consider that Dexter Lawrence is easily, in my opinion, the best interior defensive lineman in the NFL with the exception of Aaron Donald, and Aaron Donald doesn't play on a front like that. Same you can maybe say Jeffrey Simmons from the Titans, but he doesn't play on a front like that either with Azeez, with Leonard, with Kayvon, with the depth we talked about. And that's just one player. You talk about Kayvon and Azeez potentially reaching their ceilings this year and a healthy Leonard Williams. Now you're talking about what I think could be potentially top 3, maybe top 2, maybe top 1 if things break right. And I don't know if any other area of their roster has that upside, if I'm going to be completely honest about the situation.
And you brought up the depth. It's really important to bring that up because no knock on Tamon Fox. We like Tamon Fox. O'Shane Ximenez, he's okay. He's an okay player who doesn't really do the best job rushing the passer. But Boogie Basham is such an upgrade over both of those players. And I think that's going to go a long way as well. Not to mention, just like we said, Rakeem Nunez-Roches and A'Shawn Robinson as the depth pieces. If the Giants do sustain injuries like they did last year, now you have competent NFL players that you can cycle in there, and it's not going to hurt the fact that you can rush the passer. Wink Martindale, bro, he blitzed more than any team last year by a significant margin. He blitzed 39.7% of the time. The Arizona Cardinals blitzed 34.5% of the time under Vance Joseph. I expect Wink Martindale to still lead the league in blitzing, which is going to create those free rushers, which is going to create those one-on-one matchups. But last year, despite the fact that the Giants blitzed more than any other team, they were still high in terms of pressure rate, but they weren't number 1. They weren't number 2. They were number 6. They pressured the quarterback 24.3% of the time. The Giants bringing the blitz, that's going to stay the same. I think that pressure percentage, though, is going to go up. And I also think a lot of the reason why the Giants weren't getting pressure on some of those design blitzes was because those blitzes were diagnosed by opposing quarterbacks, and those quarterbacks were getting the football out of their hands very quickly. The Giants are well aware of that. Wink Martindale, he's well aware of that. So what is that going to cause? It's going to cause the New York Giants to maybe be a little bit more aggressive now that their secondary is also upgraded, and we could see some more interceptions, which the Giants desperately need because they had 6 interceptions last season. So hopefully we see some bad decisions from quarterbacks throwing to the flat, and then Deonte Banks or Trey Hawkins III biting down on it and then intercepting and taking it pick 6 to the house. Love to see that week 1 against the Dallas Cowboys, but I think that's well within the cards with this defense and this philosophy.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick. And I think about those 2 players you mentioned, Trey Hawkins and Deonte Banks. There's a bit more projection for me as far as them being upgrades, and same goes for Pinnock in the secondary. I think there is a range of outcomes, unfortunately, where the Giants secondary isn't as good as it was last year because Julian Love's loss. I'm not saying it's definite, and obviously Fabian Moreau's loss. We're hoping that it's not going to be the case. They certainly have more raw talent, I think, this year with Banks, with Pinnock, and with Hawkins as well. And look, Dan Duggan of The Athletic polled the Giants players and asked them to come out with their breakout picks for the season, and they couldn't name themselves. And the majority of those picks were Deonte Banks and Trey Hawkins. So clearly those guys are showing out in practice to their teammates as well. But I do feel like there's a lot more realized, or I should say, the higher percentage chance of the breakout to me does come on the defensive front here with the New York Giants. And so it has me really, really excited about what they can mean. And you mentioned, we've talked a bunch in the past about how the game against Trevor Lawrence, and how it was a little bit of an oddball game plan from Wink Martindale, after a very aggressive season for the most part throughout, before that game, after that game, he did a lot of drop 8, drop 7 type coverages. And there may be more quarterbacks on the schedule where he kind of wants to use that game plan against this year. And if those front 4 or front 5 are healthy this year, he may have the opportunity to actually do that, to actually just be like, I can rely on these four guys up front to rush the passer. And I can drop 7 into coverage against these better quarterbacks who are going to read the blitz and get the ball out fast, so the blitz doesn't even matter, and it's a wasted blitz. And that alone gets me excited, because there is that pit feeling in my stomach, Nick, that's like, we are facing tougher quarterbacks this year. We haven't really seen much great quarterback play in the Wink Martindale era. Is there concern there? But with the ability to potentially mix things up and drop 7 and drop 8 at times, I feel more comfortable.
One reason why the Giants were employing that against Jacksonville throughout the game was also because they were running power gap and just getting to the edge, and the Giants had to show more respect to their run fit. So they were a little bit less aggressive. But also on the final drive, when more than likely Jacksonville was not going to be running the football, they dropped 8 3 consecutive times. And I was like, wow. But they were also showing the fact that they were going to pressure. They were giving the illusion of pressure, which also can cause hesitation with some of these quarterbacks, which we've seen throughout the NFL. So just the fact that everybody knows Wink Martindale, pressure breaks pipes, that's his moniker, it's going to be in the back of the head of every quarterback. But now you have guys like Isaiah Simmons who can drop off the line of scrimmage, and he can cover a lot of space to possibly undercut a route, intercept the pass or something like that, because he is so versatile and explosive as an athlete when you don't send him on the blitz, if you do decide to drop him into coverage. I just think the personnel that Wink Martindale is working with, if they all remain healthy, knocking on wood, is so much better than what the personnel was last season, when the Giants were still a respectable defense, albeit they could not fit the run at all.
Yeah, you're right. And they're going to be healthier too. That's the key, or we hope they're going to be healthier too.
Yeah.
That's the key, because it's harder to be. We just went over 51 snaps together last year. That's an insanely low number. It's hard in my mind, at least, Nick, to imagine that can get worse. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm right about that and not wrong about that. You never know in the NFL, but that alone should help them. Let's get to the number 2 reason we're so excited about this 2023 season, and we believe this team could be so good potentially. And I think it has to be the progression we've seen from Daniel Jones within this offensive system from the start of training camp throughout every single training camp practices, the joint practices as well, which were phenomenal from everybody who was there, onlookers. Connor Hughes wrote about it. Dan Duggan wrote about it. He did a really good job in those joint practices. And then in the preseason, obviously limited opportunity in the preseason, just got a single series, but he checked all the boxes there too. And so that's a pretty steady drumbeat, Nick. And I am more along the lines, if I'm going to be honest, that I want to see it on game film. I want to see it in the real games. I don't love as much I think the training camp stuff's a little overblown. I think the preseason stuff's very overblown, especially because Kafka was scheming that game, and I felt like the opposing defense was not game planning at all. But there also has to be, you have to at least take into account the fact that Daniel Jones didn't have this kind of buzz last preseason. He didn't have this kind of buzz last training camp. It was the total opposite, right? We showed up at that blue-white scrimmage that you and I went to, and Daniel Jones did not look good in that scrimmage. I think everyone who was there could say that, and it was a little scary. And throughout training camp, we kept hearing Daniel Jones is struggling in practice, a lot of would-be sacks, a lot of incompletions, completion rate under 50%. Wink Martindale's blitzes are getting home, and it feels like all of that he's processed, how Wink runs this defense, how he can attack it. And he's taken that to a new level. We've seen him change up his arm slot a lot so far. I mentioned this yesterday in the preseason. That's something I like. I feel like the velocity is better. The timing is better. The ball's just coming out quicker, which is a product of getting more comfortable within the system. And so I think at some point, while I don't want to give preseason and training camp the most credit in the world, Nick, I have to give it a lot of credit because it's such a different narrative than where we were at last year. And what could that mean for the season? I don't know, but it's fun to think about, right? Because if Daniel Jones takes this massive step this year, I guarantee you the Giants are Super Bowl contenders. And we could be that even if like Leonard Williams gets hurt again and like all these other ancillary pieces start to get hurt or they're not what we expected them to be. If just alone Daniel Jones takes this big jump, immediately you're a Super Bowl contender. That's how important quarterback play is in winning games.
And he has the weapons at his disposal, finally. Darren Waller, Jalen Hyatt, all of the explosive playmakers that the Giants use now in his second year in this system. So that's a huge part of this, because one reason why he struggled so much wasn't just because he was a bad quarterback. every single veteran we've heard from has said that Brian Dable's system is very wordy and it's very complex. It's very complicated. Daniel Jones had to master that. Daniel Jones was getting beat up all throughout training camp, getting his ass kicked. Giants entered the season. They were much more reliant on the run and the play action. And then they started realizing, I think it was around week 3, they really started to realize Daniel Jones was really good when he's extemporizing and he's extending plays. Let's lean a little bit more on his natural athletic ability and get him on the move. We started seeing more rollouts. And we've talked a lot about how there were several iterations of the 2022 New York Giants offense. Now, Mike Kafka was able to really design a scheme, despite the fact that the Giants had a ton of injuries, and this was Daniel Jones' first year in the system. Well, now, Daniel Jones had a whole offseason in this system, and they added several playmakers that Daniel Jones really has never played with. He hasn't played with a player like Jalen Hyatt. You could say John Ross. John Ross wasn't really healthy all that often, and Jalen Hyatt hopefully has a little bit more to offer than, let's say, John Ross, who was a top 10 pick at one point, but Darren Waller too. Like, that addition alone is such a mismatch nightmare, not just because he is 6'6", he's fast as hell, and he is going to be a really tough cover for basically anybody who is going up against him, but also because Mike Kafka can now lean on 12 personnel, and your 12 personnel package is Daniel Bellinger, who was an excellent tight end option for the Giants last season as a rookie, and Darren Waller, one of the biggest mismatch nightmares in the NFL. That's going to put a lot of defensive coordinators in a bind. They're probably going to align in nickel, and then the Giants are going to run the football. And then if they go in base, the Giants are going to pass the football. It's the chess match of football right there. And I think the Giants gain a little bit more of an edge with a player like Darren Waller because, yeah, he's not a great blocker, but he can lose slow enough, right? And then Daniel Bellinger is definitely a plus blocker as a tight end. So I think Daniel Jones has so many things going for him, how Mike Kafka can call this offense, and he has a better, more comprehensive understanding of said offense. And it's only going to lead to more success on the football field. But again, you need to see it manifest because defenses, they're going to be tracking on this. I think it's not going to be, I don't think rushing lanes are going to be as open as they were last year for Daniel Jones. It's not going to be the Chicago Bears week 4 where they're just like, I don't think Daniel Jones can run at all. And Daniel Jones just ran all over them. I still think he'll be mobile and he's going to use his legs, but it might not be as easy. I think teams are tracking on the fact that he is pretty damn athletic.
It's a good point because we can't expect everything they did last year to work again. Teams have tape on that. And so they're going to have to change things up. But in reality, I feel like it's going to lead to a better version of him because he's going to be relying more on his arm and relying more on getting rid of the football fast to the spot it's supposed to be. And I think he can do that. And we've, talked in the past, Nick, we've debated, it's an age-old football debate, like what's more important, giving the quarterback continuity in the system or improving the system? And this was the Jason Garrett debate after its first season. We were very strong on, improving the coordinator. And Dave Gettleman was very, very strong on we need to give Daniel Jones the same system 2 years in a row. It was another, not as talked about mishap by Dave Gettleman, just another mistake by him, a bad decision by him, to be completely honest. I mean, look, it was a dumb decision. That's like one of the most defined ones too. Like,
you think he made some mistakes while he was the GM, Dan?
Yeah, but some of them, people forget about. That's one I don't think I've ever even heard really people discuss. And think of how big a mistake that was to really, and he made it clear, like, we need to give Daniel Jones, but it's not like he's making that up. Like, he's been in the NFL for a while, Gettleman, and there is some value to a lot of value to giving the quarterback a second year in the system, especially if it's like Andy Reid with Mahomes, right? Like, God bless. The more years that Mahomes gets with Reid, the better he is. The more years any quarterback gets with Kyle Shanahan, the better he is. The same is now true of any quarterback with Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka. And so Daniel Jones getting that second year with Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka is going to help him become a better quarterback. It's not like your second year with Jason Garrett. So I think it's really important to consider that as well. And Nick, I want to, before we tie up this conversation, this part of this conversation, I want to ask you what your thoughts are on something I brought up earlier regarding training camp in the preseason, because obviously last offseason, taking it back to there, Jones had that bad training camp, the bad scrimmage, and it ended up meaning absolutely nothing. He had his career year, best season we've seen of him. How much value do you put in like how strong of a camp someone's having against, in these mostly padless practices and like the joint practices and the preseason stuff?
Not a lot. Daniel Jones in his first year, because I want him to make those mistakes. I want him to take those bumps. I want him to take risks in training camp, and I want him to learn. And in order to do that, you got to make mistakes. You got to be a little bit bold. If he's throwing interceptions, I don't exactly know what's going on, but that's happening in year one as he's adjusting to the system. Similar to Deontay Banks struggling a little bit in training camp this year. I'm not overly worried. I mean, I'm a little worried just because the rookie's going against CeeDee Lamb and stuff like that, but I'm not like, oh, he had a bad camp, he's terrible. Allow those mistakes to happen in training camp. If this was year 2 and Daniel Jones is making a lot of those mistakes now that he has a more firm grasp of the system, I would raise an eyebrow, but that's still not something that's like, oh, he sucks or he's not taking the system, because they could be trying new things. So it's just a little bit of conjecture on our part to assume that he's sucking because he's struggling and not knowing what exactly to do, or are they trying new things and seeing if it actually works?
And on the flip side of it, like him having so much success could also be the flip side on the defensive side of the ball, right? And things of that nature. It's hard to really project that. I think I'm more excited about Jones because of what I've seen from him, from the the ability to change those arm slots, and two, from just having that second year in the system. That's what has me even more excited than like him having a good camp and things like that.
And even in preseason against Carolina, what do you get? 10 plays. The Giants dropped him back 10 times. They were moving Darren Waller all over the formation. They were moving the pocket. They were doing play action slides. They were doing option plays, RPOs. They were doing a lot of creative shit. And when they get in the red zone, we know they're going to do a lot of creative stuff. What did they do? They aligned Darren Waller out wide. They motioned him in. They had Daniel Bellinger block, and then Daniel Bellinger just slipped underneath Darren Waller's release, and he just basically created a pick. This one thing that this coaching staff, which is going to bleed into point number 3, if you just want to have this beautiful segue like Paul Blart on Mall Cop, the coaching edge. We could start on offense. The coaching edge is the third point that Dan and I want to stress. And I haven't covered an NFL team, the New York Giants specifically, that has a coaching staff who understands how to really maximize rub routes and how to create space. And you see it just off of things as subtle as the wide receiver releases, their alignment, whether they're condensed in a bunch, in a stack. Think about the first play of preseason with Daniel Jones against Carolina. Daniel Bellinger's release there. He was in a stack. They motioned him into a stack. Daniel Bellinger releases and follows the exact path of the wide receiver's release. I think it might have been Isaiah Hodgins, whatever. Regardless of the fact, he goes into that route, and it's basically an option play, because the linebacker who was covering Darren Waller, best of luck, flowed over the top of that release. The original receiver who released off the line of scrimmage is acting as a pick. If the linebacker flows over the top of that, then Darren Waller is going to break back inside. If the linebacker stays to the inside, Darren Waller is going to run to the flat. Either way, Darren Waller's open. It's putting defenders into conflict. We've talked about it for years. Maybe not as much with Jason Garrett because it didn't happen all that often. But this coaching staff really knows how to do that. They know how to tag options off of the conflict. They really stress specific defenders. And when you have a running back like Saquon Barkley, which a lot of defensive coordinators are circling, then you can use the play action element and the zone read element, RPO element, to get Daniel Jones on the move and create half field reads where you have multiple 3-level reads plus Daniel Jones's legs, which we also saw in the preseason game on the 25-yard catch to Isaiah Hodgins. So there's just so many options that Mike Kafka affords Daniel Jones and this offense. And I really feel like a huge reason why I'm confident in this team this year, because of Mike Kafka and Brian Dable's ability to scheme players open and put defenders into conflict.
I agree. I debated whether we should put that 2 or 3. I just feel like the confidence level that we both have right now with Jones heading into the season, it could be 1 too. It really could be 1. But I was just so stunned by that stat that Doug Analytics put out about how dominant the defensive line was with those 4 healthy, be it over a small sample size. But I do feel like the Jones thing too. I just feel a lot of confidence with him heading into the season. I'm higher on Daniel Jones right now, obviously, than I've ever been. That was the case last season for us both as well. We really came along. You could check out our film reviews last year and see some of the Twitter threads we put out there to see, more evidence on that. But as far as the coaching edge goes, I love that you broke down the subtleties, right? Because you can look at this from the micro level like that, or the macro level. The macro level that I want to focus on, and because you just did a good job breaking down the subtleties, is the fact that every single week it feels like they have a different game plan for the opponent. That did not feel like that was the case for Ben McAdoo. It obviously wasn't if you look at the tape, or Jason Garrett. I know at times Jason Garrett tried to do some things, but it didn't really land, and he wasn't committed to them really, in my opinion. Like, it would be like a handful of times in the game. But this,
in his defense too, not to cut you off, and I'm not going to sit here and just defend Jason Garrett, but his offensive line the entire time he was there was horrible.
True. That is a problem. It's hard to run an offense with a bad offensive line.
And he never really had Saquon Barkley either.
I will say this, Nick. It's hard to run an offense with a bad offensive line, but I feel like Kafka and Dable kind of figured it out last year. At times, that offensive line was really bad. When Neal was hurt, when they had issues on the interior, like it wasn't as bad because Thomas was there, right? Of course. Like, Garrett never really had prime Andrew Thomas.
And he didn't have any Saquon Barkley either. Because, he had a little bit of injured Saquon Barkley, but that didn't really count.
It doesn't really count. So these are definite unfair, parts of. But even if you just look at just the difference in how often they're using pre-snap motion, the subtleties you discussed, the macro level of every single week, it felt like almost Kafka and Dable introduced something new in the run game from a blocking standpoint. Every single week, it felt like they were introducing new passing concepts as well. Some they relied on more often than others. It felt like maybe the run game was a bit more diverse, but that's okay. In the passing game, they found something they found success with. And even like you like to always mention, Nick, that's the phases of the season where the offense was like the run heavy, run through Barkley. Then it was the shotgun heavy, go through Jones. Just that ability to change your offense and adapt in season like that, in addition to adapting on a week-to-week basis to the opponent, is really impressive stuff. Like, you think it should be obvious, things like using pre-snap motion, stacking the receivers, bunch formation, rub routes to create free releases. All these things seem obvious to us and to people who follow the game at this level. But like, then again, McAdoo wasn't doing it. Garrett wasn't really doing it. And I feel like if you look across the NFL, like whatever his first name, Canada and the Steelers, like a lot of these coordinators that I look at film of, and I'm watching this tape, I'm like, this passing game is so stale and it's lacking so much diversity. And how do you expect to win? I mean, you can, like, McCarthy found a way to do it with Aaron Rodgers, but he had Aaron Rodgers. Like, yeah, if you have an elite quarterback, you can probably get away with a stale offense. But then again, if you have an elite quarterback and you have a diverse offense, a la Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, now you can cook with gas when you have Marquez Scantling running 90% around and Justin Watson, who literally was, in my opinion, one of the worst receivers in the NFL running routes last year, like created zero separation whatsoever. And I don't think Valdez Scantling, by the way, creates any separation either. Every time I watch the Chiefs on tape, I was like, there's no separation created outside of Travis Kelce here. So when you have that kind of thing come together, Jones maybe taking that step, the consistency from Kafka and Dable on a week-to-week basis, that's when you start to think, like, can this offense, can this passing game take that next step? And it feels like they really have an opportunity to.
And I think they will. And if we flip it on the defensive side of the football, it's Wink Martindale with upgraded personnel. And you have two rookies back there starting at cornerback, a little bit problematic, yes. The improvement of the pass rush is going to take some off their shoulders, as we brought up. And then there's Bobby Okereke, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit later too. So when's the last time the Giants had a linebacker like this guy?
I would say it was, and he only did it for like a season or a half a season.
John Beeson?
It was John Beeson when they traded for Beeson, but then he got injured again. There was a lot of injury problems with him. Before that, interior, like Michael Boley was good, but he wasn't that role.
No,
so
he wasn't that role.
Before Beeson and for like a longer period,
Antonio Pierce.
It's Pierce. It goes all the way back to 2008 range with Pierce.
Exactly. I think that's one thing where, like, yeah, they signed him to $10 million a year. It's a little bit much, which you can argue it is, but just watching him in preseason and also watching through his Colts tapes, like, dude, this guy's a ball magnet. He knows where to be at all times. He's wildly physical. He's very disciplined. He has a little bit of an edge to him, as Giant fans found out in week 17 last year. His addition with Wink Martindale, as you brought up last podcast, I believe it was, it's going to add a little bit to the pass rush as well. A little bit of juice to the pass rush. I think he's a good coverage linebacker as well in terms of his long arms. He's athletic. He's smart. Wink Martindale could just do so much with a player like this. And we just haven't seen a linebacker like Bobby Okereke wearing Giants blue in so damn long.
You're right. And you think about him getting his hands up in those pass lanes. I think he'll be better in zone coverage than man coverage. Personally, I looked at some of the stats as we were going over the podcast we did yesterday for breakouts, and he obviously made the list for me. I felt he gave up a high catch percentage last year, but must have been some snaps. But again, we've talked about this in the past, Nick. No one besides Fred Warner is covering anybody in man coverage at that position. It's just
the linebacker catches given up to me is such a dumb stat.
It is such a shitty stat
because a lot of them are third and long, and you just allow the guy to catch it, rally and tackle.
Yes, and then that goes on you for giving up a catch. You're right, and that's just stupid. And your catch percentage looks bad, but it's like, that's kind of a good win for the defense because they threw short of the sticks and you tackled him before he got to the sticks and now they're punting. Like, we can't give that a negative. It's stupid. I was thinking about, I wonder if, and I'll talk about the larger point after this. It's just something fun I was thinking about. I wonder if Daniel Jones and Bobby Okereke ever had a conversation about that week 17 game and like, what do you think they ever did? I feel like I want to think they did.
I want to say someone on the beat asked Bobby Okereke that, but it was like before he arrived to the building and he was like, nah. Who would be the one to approach the other one?
100%.
It would have to be Bobby because it's not Daniel Jones.
No shot.
I think So that's the thing, because Eli, people would be like, yeah, Eli's a little reserved. Eli would be the one to approach Bobby Okereke.
He'd be already have pranked the hell out of Bobby Okereke. If it was Eli, Bobby Okereke would have woken up after the first day of training camp with like dog shit in his excuse my language, in his locker, in like his cleats or something in his locker room.
Yeah, it would have been great. But yeah, it would definitely have to be Bobby Okereke. They probably just laughed about it. Look, they're competitors. If I'm Bobby Okereke, I'm taking that stuff personally too. Not because the Giants are doing anything wrong. It's because your team is an absolute laughing stock. You just blew a huge lead against the Minnesota Vikings, and now you're having Daniel Jones run all over your defense in the second half of a game. It's like, damn, I would have a chip on my shoulder. I'd probably throw a little bit of a cheap shot as well. And then it's Jeff Saturday coming out after the game, calling out Kayvon Thibodeau for the Snow Angels, which I can easily see how that's in poor taste and how that's perceived to be in poor taste. Thibodeau claims he didn't know, whatever. But Bobby Okereke walking the line, towing the line when he would tackle Daniel Jones in the one play.
There's no doubt about that. But to your larger point, Nick, I feel like last year the Giants won a lot of games because Wink Martindale had creative blitzes at key spots, batted balls to line of scrimmage, typically some really big calls and execution by the players who were on the field. Big call. And obviously, Dexter Lawrence was, in my opinion, the best player on the Giants by far last season. I think Andrew Thomas has a case to be second best, but I think if you're looking at best from the film standpoint, it was Dexter Lawrence. He wrecked games for opposing offenses. And that helps. But outside of like Lawrence, considering the injuries to Aziz and Leonard and kind of even Adoree Jackson as well, and you can take Kayvon out of that, but he'd even miss some time as well. You didn't have that much to work with from a personnel standpoint, I felt like, on the defense side of the ball. Now, I think you talked about Bobby Okereke being added to the mix, A'Shawn Robinson, getting back the big names health-wise, adding a Deonte Banks-type talent to the roster, maybe Jason Pinnock as well. And he's just working with so much more. And he found a way to come up in big spots on those third downs and in the red zone. And look, the Giants won a lot of games, but they didn't score a lot of points last year. They won a lot of games by close, like you said. I think it was 8 one-score games, if I'm not mistaken the number, 8 or 9. And a lot of them were low scoring, right? But they had a few 30-point games at the end against Minnesota, and I believe one other team the Colts in Minnesota. But outside of that, Wink Martindale's unit came to play despite him not having that much talent to work with. And that gives me confidence that, again, we have that coaching edge on the defense side of the ball. I felt like, with the exception of Kellen Moore and maybe a couple other games that I'm not thinking of right now, no one really out-schemed Wink Martindale last year. You could look at the Eagles games, Nick, and be like, what about the Eagles games? The Eagles offense did good against Giants. It's like, was that scheme or was that personnel? And I feel like the answer to that was a personnel advantage. So outside of the Cooper Rush game with Kellen Moore and maybe a couple others in the beginning I'm not thinking of right now, I feel like he had the edge there too on a weekly basis. So I do feel confident with Wink Martindale, and I'm excited to see him actually work with a little bit more talent on the defense side of the ball.
I love that you brought up the Cooper Rush game, because it's just like the Giants didn't know they were terrible yet in terms of their linebackers. I'm sure they probably internally knew, but they're like, you know what? In week 1 and week 2, they haven't exploited it yet, so maybe we could keep it quiet. Kellen Moore was like, nah, son. And he just started running crack toss, and the Giants just couldn't do anything to stop Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. And another thing about Wink Martindale's defense, and we'll move on after this, he was just highly efficient, which doesn't always carry over, which gives me a little bit of, I'm a little upset about that. I wish it always carried over, but he was highly efficient on third down. And one reason is because he's so deceptive with, is he bringing pressure? Is he dropping? Is he sending the pressure? He sent the pressure a lot, ran a lot of cover zero last year. I think it was around 10%, which is just an absolutely insane. And a lot of it was from quarter personnel. So you're just talking about a lot of speed.
We don't have it in front of us. We'll find that out, but I don't think the next highest was 5% or lower for cover zero.
Dude, I don't think the next highest was even 1%.
That's insane.
I'm not even lying.
1 out of every 10 snaps, he's running cover zero. And for those who don't know, Nick, just in case people are new to the podcast, go over real quick what cover zero is.
Cover zero just means there's no safety. So there's a bunch of people blitzing and it's man coverage across the board. So it's mano-a-mano in terms of cornerback on wide receiver, running back on linebacker, no safety help over the top. And Wink Martindale sends it, bro. He loves himself some cover zero, and he has the personnel to really employ it now. And also in the red zone, he forced a lot of field goals. The Giants were really efficient in the red zone. That also doesn't always carry over. But I think when you have players like Dexter Lawrence and you have guys on the back end as well now with a little bit of an upgrade there, and you also have the philosophy and scheme of Wink Martindale where you have no idea what the hell is coming, it allows you to be, or it leads you to be a little bit more efficient on defense. So that's one reason, because, dude, like I said, you align 7, 8 guys on the line of scrimmage, you bail and you only send 3. You got to process the fact that there's 3, and now you have 8 guys in space covering. Eventually, Kayvon Thibodeau, Azeez Ojulari, and Dexter Lawrence or Leonard Williams, whoever's rushing the passer, is going to get home at one point. Not to mention the Giants send a lot of simulated pressures as well, where they only send 4, but they act like they're going to send 6 or 7, and you don't know where those 4 are coming from, creating free rushers. One of the reasons why, and we kind of, I don't want to say criticize Kayvon Thibodeau for this, but we just acknowledge it because it's a reality. He had 4 sacks last season. 2 of them were unblocked. Some of the reasons why he had a lot of unblocked sack opportunities, as well as other players on the Giants, is because of Wink Martindale's scheme. It's all about pre-snap alignment and manipulating the opposing protection package.
Yep, exactly right. And so, yeah, fourth thing we're going to go with here, Nick, we alluded to a little bit earlier, but we're excited about the simple fact here, the Giants have more mismatches on the offensive side of the ball from a skill position standpoint than they had last year. And in my opinion, they've had quite some time. And I want to start with the number one for me, and it's Darren Waller. I actually took some time, Nick, a little while ago to go back and watch some film from his career year. Luckily, as you know, Nick, and you have some access from it in your own way now, we have some access to old tape. And I watched him that year with Gruden, and I just thought it was so unique the ways that Gruden utilized him to get him open on the vertical plane and then also on the horizontal plane. And then I started to see some of that in training camp, and I started to see some of that in the preseason in that one drive. And I started to think about it and listening to to George Kittle, who went on a podcast and said the fastest tight end at tight end U by far is Darren Waller. And they said he's the strongest too, which I didn't really understand at the time, but I kind of get it now watching some of his tape, the way he gets into his routes and the way he can kind of create that separation and how strong he is at the contact point, where really he shows off all those traits, the ability to adjust in air, that body control. I don't think he's lost from what I've seen this preseason and training camp. I think he's still the same player. Does he, is he maybe an injury prone guy? Is he not? 2019 was his breakout season. That's the one I'm referencing. 2020, 2020, or 2020, 2021, 2022, some injuries for sure. But like right now, he looks just like the player that he put the film of. And even if like some of the tape we went, remember that Steelers game we looked at, Nick, right when they traded for Waller, he looked the same in that tape. And that was from last year after he came back from the injury. And, he had bad injuries last year early on. He's been fully healthy so far in camp. No scares yet for Darren Waller. So I just think adding him to this offense creates a bigger mismatch than people realize. Like, I will take him as a mismatch over a lot of players that people think right now, Nick, are better than him. Like, I'm just going to run through some names that to me, he's a better mismatch than. T. Higgins. I love T. Higgins, man. I think he's a great player in the NFL, Nick. I think Darren Waller is a bigger mismatch on a snap-to-snap basis. I think you can do more with him as a coordinator, right? And he's viewed as let's throw some other names out there. Keenan Allen, great player, gets open in the slot, has a great rapport with Justin Herbert. Is he the same mismatch that Darren Waller is or anywhere close? No. And you could go through a lot of players that people think, even like DeAndre Hopkins, the Giants fans wanted to trade for him. I think Darren Waller adds more from a mismatch standpoint than Hopkins does. Can you guard him with a linebacker? Can you guard him with a safety? Do you have to put your best player on Waller? Do you have to put multiple players on Waller? Are there going to be situations like we've seen already in the preseason where 3 different guys are in the joint practice where 3 different guys are focusing on Darren Waller in the red zone, and then Darius Slayton's wide open, this is from the joint practices, to catch a touchdown in the red zone? And so I don't know if all that stuff's happening with those types of wide receivers. I know it's going to happen with Waller when he's on the field. And so that's the first guy I want to touch on. We can get into Jalen Hyatt and what he could also offer the offense, but I think Waller's impact, it's something that could be really special for the Giants this year.
I wonder, and this just dawned on me, and I love all the information you just put out there. Is there a team in the NFL that has, and there might be, that has a bigger mismatch combination at running back and tight end than the New York Giants?
Great question. Not the Chiefs. I don't really think any of those running backs are mismatches.
Not the Ravens.
Not Mark Andrews and the Ravens. I mean, J.K. Dobbins, I like him, but I like him more as like a between the tackles processor and somebody who really understands where the hole is going to be than a mismatch that you have to worry about. So not the Ravens. I don't really find Hawkinson to be that impressive of a tight end. I think he's just like a fantasy guy that caught a shit ton of passes and had a ton of targets last year. He's not my guy. Evan Ingram's kind of a mismatch. You can maybe consider Ingram ETN. I wouldn't put that. I wouldn't put him in the.
But to me, Waller and Saquon are so much. That's my point. So when teams run man coverage, which is a coverage that the Giants and every NFL team is going to see a lot on 3rd down, 3rd and short, 3rd and medium, I feel like the Giants are going to have a natural advantage when they're facing man coverage just off of two players, 12 and 26, and Darren Waller and Saquon Barkley. And that doesn't even include all of their outside guys and all the scheme that comes from Mike Kafka and Brian Dable, right? So
we're 8, right?
I'm sorry?
We're number
Or
8 too, because he can move
number 8.
the ball in those third and short situations or third and long.
Absolutely. And when you have to worry about Waller and Saquon and all those other players in Kafka, 8, you could forget about them if you don't have a quarterback spy. And that's also going to slow down pass rush at times. I don't think a lot of teams are going to dial back their pass rush, but if Daniel Jones is consistently burning defenses, those edge rushers might play contain, and they might rush contain and also try to collapse on the B gap, which so many teams didn't do last year. It's like, holy crap. They just kept trying to run around Evan Neal. It's like, good. Just keep trying to run around him. Daniel Jones is going to step up, maneuver the pocket, and then pick up 6, 7, 8 yards in a first down, which he did so often, Dan. So that's one thing that I think we haven't really brought up yet, but the mismatch combination of Saquon Barkley and Darren Waller, it could be the best in the league at tight end and running back.
I love that. I don't think we're being homers and saying that it is the best in the league, honestly, from a mismatch standpoint, right? From like what you have to allocate as a defense resources wise to stop these players. And then, like you said, you add in Jones's dual threat, and that changes it a lot as well. Go ahead.
And it's just like linebacker or safety against these specific players in man coverage. I feel like the Giants and Daniel Jones is going to know, hey, 56 out there, he doesn't have 26, right? 12 out there. It's good.
Have linebackers and safeties to match up with these guys. We think about all the teams that have them, like the Fred Warner types and all these star type safety players that can do it. But like a lot of these teams haven't invested recently in those positions and don't have that. Like think about the Giants last year. They had Jalen Smith and Austin Calitro at linebacker. Like that's going to happen for some teams the Giants play this year. And there's going to be some teams that don't have the safeties either that play the role that can match up with these guys in man.
Unfortunately, the Cowboys aren't one of those teams because Jaron Kearse is one of the best man covering safeties in the league. He's very physical. He's very long. Doesn't mean Darren Waller can't get the best of them, but they got some dudes on the back end in terms of covering big tight ends.
For sure. And now let's get into some other players that could be also mismatches this year. Both sides of the ball, I'm going to say. Jalen Hyatt, I'm going to throw out there. Isaiah Simmons, I'm going to throw out there. Anyone else you want to throw out there, or do you want to touch on any of those players more than that?
I think we touched a little bit on Hyatt, and we've touched a lot on Simmons since the Giants have acquired him, so I don't want to be too redundant here. But all I want to say, and I know we've brought this up in the past, Jalen Hyatt, the Giants ran a ton of stutter goes last year, where the wide receiver on the outside the numbers, and this is against middle of the field closed looks, and that's cover one, which the Dallas Cowboys and Dan Quinn run a lot. Whenever that middle of the field safety, Daniel Jones is going to take the snap, is going to look to his left, know that Jalen Hyatt is running a stutter go. That's going to influence the safety to the left, and then he's going to come back to the right, and he's going to take that one-on-one shot. Jalen Hyatt is going to decelerate and sink his hips at the sticks about 10 yards down the field. Giants love to open drives with this, and then he's just going to explode. He did it against Sauce Gardner on the first play of the game, Dan, and he had Sauce Gardner beat by like 3.5 yards. Sauce can say whatever the hell he wants. He was toast. A better throw, it's done. Safety wasn't going to get over there. The Giants are going to incorporate this on 1st and 10, sudden change situations to open drives, to open games. And I think just Jalen Hyatt's speed, I don't know if cornerbacks are quite aware of how fast this dude truly is. And not just how fast, Dan, but how explosive he is out of the break once he goes into those stutter and acts as if he is decelerating and coming back towards the quarterback. So I'm looking forward to that because I love Trevon Diggs. I think he's a fantastic cornerback. He's a bit aggressive, but a bit aggressive means he's going to bite down on that. And I don't think he has the type of recovery speed to catch back up if Hyatt gains that step.
I love that you brought that up, Nick, because I think about Dan Quinn, how aggressive he is on defense, a lot of, like you said, middle of the field closed looks. And that to me is always a treat when I face it, for me personally, when the Giants get to face those types of coordinators, Nick, because I've made this point a bunch in the past, but to me on film, Daniel Jones is a much better quarterback against man than zone. It's been the case since his rookie year. All of his good games in his rookie year came against man-heavy defenses, Detroit Lions. He's just, in my mind, he can diagnose it better and he gets the ball out. He's more confident, I feel like, in where it's going to be, right? In zone, there's windows that are there, but you got to really have the confidence that you're going to get the ball in there, and it's not always going to look as pretty. And man, you just have to find the right matchup and trust it. And so I like that they may face a little bit of man week one, and then I like the second point you made. Man-heavy defense with a lot of aggression from Dan Quinn, and then Trevon Diggs, an aggressive corner who might bite on one of those routes. I think we're going to have a good chance to get a big play in the passing game in week one against the Cowboys. I don't know if it's going to be Slayton or if it's going to be Hyatt. That I'm not sure of on the outside, again, but I think it's going to come against Diggs. And I think it's going to come against this style of defense. And even think back to 2 years ago, Nick, when everything was going bad for the Giants. Jason Garrett was still the coordinator. I believe Jones played most of the game. Then he got concussed and Glennon came in. Kadarius Toney whooped Trayvon Diggs, and Trayvon Diggs played him super aggressively. And Toney just absolutely hammered him for like 169 in a game. What was it like? He had like 170 yards or something crazy in the game, despite getting ejected in the game. And so I just think about that. Diggs, Quinn with some with some middle of the field closed looks. I'm excited, man. I think we could be getting an explosive play right away in week 1 potentially.
Just need about a 6, maybe even a 7-man protection. Because I am worried about Micah Parsons.
Yeah, I know. And that's why it didn't happen in week 1 or the Thanksgiving game. It was mostly that. It was that they couldn't feel comfortable dialing up those plays because they didn't feel comfortable in 5 or 7 step drops.
Week 3 was it was week 3, but that was a eye-opening experience for Giant fans and for all, because we were 2-0 heading into that game. And Evan Neal's talks like, man, I've never gotten my ass kicked like that throughout my entire career. I was always dominant, and he had a bad game. He was also, I think was he dealing with the injury by that point?
I don't know.
No, I don't think so. But no, he got hurt against Jacksonville. My bad. But either way, it was a rough game for Evan Neal. And that's, like I said a little bit earlier in the podcast, that's kind of when the Giants were like, damn, Daniel Jones is tough and he's fast and he's athletic. And he didn't have over like 100 rushing yards or anything, but how many times in the second half of that game was that guy just scrambling around, just taking huge hits from Dallas? Let's not see those huge hits. But I think it did open the eyes of this coaching staff. Like, our offensive line is an issue. We're going to have to incorporate a lot of move the pocket and allow Daniel Jones to get out on the move. So we're probably going to see that again. I just hope that the Giants, which they're going to run bootleg, they should run bootleg, but don't naked bootleg to Micah Parsons too often, because I just don't think that guy is going to bite all that frequently. And if Daniel Jones goes the naked bootleg and turns right into 11 on Dallas, I'm just scared to see what was going to happen.
Yeah, we don't want that situation arising. All right, let's get to number 5, our final reason why we're so excited about the Giants season. Some people might be like, why wasn't this one? Well, Nick and I have been staunch believers, and we've made it clear on this podcast that we believe NFL games are mostly decided by the passing game, but you need the run game as a foundation. You need to at least be competent in that regard. Or you can have what happened to the Giants multiple times last year. Teams just run the same scheme over and over on them, power gap principles and different types of things to get to the outside, and you get crushed like the Giants against the Eagles. So with that said, number 5, we feel pretty confident the Giants did a really good job and are either there or as close without being there as they can get to, and will be there at some point this season, to eliminating what was honestly their biggest weakness from last year. And that was their run defense in 2022. It ranked among the worst in the NFL. It killed them in multiple games, including the playoff game that they lost. And their decision to sign Bobby Okereke to that contract, bring in A'Shawn Robinson, bring in Nacho, bring in Boogie Basham, Jordan Riley, a draft pick who they loved and is showing out early, Micah McFadden taking that step and hopefully that second-year step in run defense. I feel a lot more confident now, Nick, that they're going to – I'm not saying they're going to have the best run defense in the NFL. That seems ridiculous to say considering how bad they were last year. But I have confidence they're going to emerge as a slightly above average run defense in 2023. And that alone takes it from their biggest weakness to average, little above average, and that's good. That's all you need.
I think they could be top 10 if everything works out for them. I think they have the talent to be there. There are a few players on this team that I look at and I'm like, I'm a little concerned about you against the run. Micah McFadden, I'm going to put in there. I'm not overly concerned about him against the run. That's one of the reasons why I had him as one of my sleepers yesterday. But is there a situation or a scenario where it might not work out all that well? Yeah, there is. But I've seen flashes of a good run defender, especially with him not being the main guy. It's not like he's playing next to Tay Crowder or even Jalen Smith. He's going to be playing against or next to Bobby Okereke. But I don't know how much this player is going to see the football field, but I'm a little worried if he does. And it's going to be in the slot, which is a very important position. And it's Cordell Flott. That's one player that I'm like, I don't know how much I trust him in terms of being a run defender. But other than that, Dan, Adoree Jackson, who will likely see the slot quite a bit, Deonte Banks, Trey Hawkins III, Jason Pinnock. I have confidence in all of those players. They're all defensive backs in terms of fitting the run and not being liabilities and not missing a lot of tackles. Azeez Ojulari is another player that kind of gets grouped in here. I think he's going to be a little bit more situational. I think you're going to see Jihad Ward and Boogie Basham out there. Both of those players I'm confident in terms of run defense. So I'm looking around at this team with the upgrades that they made. And I think the ceiling in terms of run defense is top 10. That's the ceiling. Now, will they reach it? I'm not sure, but that's freaking far better than what they were last year. They ranked like 28th in terms of rushing yards allowed per game. And I wish I had a stat to really figure out how much of that was against power gap, because they had to be dead last.
I think I could look that up after this from True Media. There is definitely some good info on that, and I think it was a massive difference for the Giants against power gap than zone rushing teams. The reason I'm a little more skeptical that it's going to be as good as top 10 is I still feel like, just from the overall film we watched last year, they did have some trouble with Thibodeau included. I like Thibodeau as a backside run defender, but with Thibodeau and Ojulari, as far as setting the edge in the run game. And that's something that is non-negotiable for a good for a top 10 run defense, I should say. And then my other thing is, I do think Pinnock has the skill set to be a good run defender, but I do want to see it a little bit more. I feel like he was good as a blitzer, but there's such a different, like, to be a good run defender and fitting that alley, be a good alley defender. I feel like it's more like kind of the things that Julian Love did, like just being in the right spot at the right time and just a lot of mental processing. And I'm not saying he can't do that. It's just something I want to see first before feeling confident. And then the third thing is what you brought up, which is a big concern for me. Anytime Flott's on the field in run defense or any of those kind of types of corners from the nickel spot.
The Giants, as we've said several times, they bring a lot of blitz, a lot of pressure. And sometimes when you do that, your run fits get all screwed up. But I say that, and then I also think back to when Wink Martindale was the defensive coordinator of the Ravens, and I feel like the Ravens had a really staunch, really strong physical run defense while he was there. And it was actually the coverage that was the issue, specifically in his last year because of all the injuries that he suffered. So it's possible, and I think the Giants have the personnel to still be a very good run defense.
Yeah, I think you're right. The ceiling is there. All right, that's all we have for today on the Big Blue Banter podcast. These are the 5 reasons we're most excited about the Giants in 2023. Thank you again for listening, subscribing, hopefully, iTunes, Spotify, on YouTube. We are close, by the way, Nick, to what our goal was, to get to week 1. That's 3 days from now, and have 5,000 subscribers on YouTube. We are at 4.9 something right now. So please, if you haven't already subscribed, help us get over the hump and get to 5K. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week. We will be talking to you very soon. We have a couple more podcasts coming before the game on Sunday. And then obviously the recap live after the game Sunday night.